Do you know who Helen Keller was? She was a lady who was born in the 1880s. She was born both deaf and blind. Helen Keller, born in 1880 and died in 1968, contracted an unknown illness at 19 months old, and it left her both deaf and blind. Helen's parents hired a tutor, Anne Sullivan, who lived with them. She taught Helen how to communicate, read, and write. Helen went on to become a highly successful person. She earned a bachelor's degree from Radcliffe College and became renowned for her participation as a political activist. Helen's life was riddled with trials, tribulations, and stresses which molded her into a great leader. During a particular distressing time of her life, she accidentally plagiarized a story. Let's listen to her personal account of the experience. The winter of 1892 was darkened by one cloud in my childhood's bright sky. Joy deserted my heart, and for a long time I lived in doubt, anxiety, and fear. Remember, she's 11 years old at this point. Books lost their charm for me, and even now the thought of those dreadful days chilled my heart. A little story called The Frost King, which I wrote and sent to Mr. Anagos of the Perkins Institute for the Blind, was the root of the trouble. In order to make the matter clear, I must set forth the facts connected to this episode, which justice to my teacher and to myself compels me to relate. I wrote the story when I was at home, the autumn after I learned to speak. We had stayed up at Fern Quarry later than usual, and while we were there, Miss Sullivan had described to me the beauties of the late foliage, and it seems to me that her descriptions revived the memory of a story which must have been read to me, and which I must have unconsciously retained. I thought then that I was making up the story, as children say, and I eagerly sat down to write it before the ideas should slip from me. My thoughts flowed easily, and I felt a sense of joy in the composition. Words and images came tripping out of my finger ends, and as I thought out sentence after sentence, I wrote them on my braille slate. Now, if words and images come to me without effort, it is pretty sure a sign that they are not the offspring of my own mind, but stray waifs that I regretfully dismiss. At the time, I eagerly absorbed everything I read without a thought of authorship, and even now I cannot be quite sure of the boundary line between my ideas and those I find in the books. I suppose that is because so many of my impressions come to me through the medium of others' eyes and ears. When the story was finished, I read it to my teacher, and I recall how vividly the pleasure I felt in the more beautiful passages and my annoyance at being interrupted to have the pronunciation of the word corrected. At dinner it was read to the assembled family, who were surprised that I could write so well. Some asked me if I had read it in a book. This question surprised me very much, for I had not the faintest recollection of having had read it me. I spoke up and said, "Oh no, it is my story, and I have written it for Mr. Anagos." Accordingly, I copied the story and sent it to him for his birthday. It was suggested that I change the title from Autumn Leaves to The Frost King, which I did. I carried the little story to the post office myself, feeling as if I were walking on air. I little dreamed how cruelly I should pay for that little gift. Mr. Agnos was delighted with The Frost King and published it in one of the Perkins Institution reports. This was the pinnacle of my happiness, from which I was a little while dashed to the earth. I had been born in Boston only a short time when it was discovered that a similar story, The Frost King, had The Frost Fairies by Miss Margaret Canby, had appeared before I was born in the book called Bertie and His Friends. The two stories were so much alike in thought and language that it was evident that Miss Canby's story had been read to me, and that mine was a plagiarism. This is Helen Keller's account from The Story of My Life. So what do you think are the consequences for plagiarism? What are the unfortunate consequences for her? At first, Mr. Anagos, who was her close friend, stood by her side. He firmly believed that she had not intentionally plagiarized the original book by Miss Canby. Later, however, another instructor claimed that Helen confessed to intentionally plagiarizing. The teacher related the information to Mr. Anagos, and this apparent information destroyed Helen's relationship with her most beloved mentor. The accusation of plagiarism shrouded Helen's talent for words and writing. She didn't write creatively for many years after this event.